So did anything good come out of the Callisto protocol? I've written and spoken extensively about the failings of the Callisto protocol, whether you followed my contributions to DualShockers around the time of its release, or just follow me on the website formerly known as Twitter. It's no secret that I did not care for the main campaign at launch. It was, without a doubt, one of the worst executed horror games I've ever experienced. But, much like my friend October, check out her stuff by the way, fantastic art, while we both detested the game itself in our reviews, there was undeniable potential for someone to unfuck this mess of a game into something worth playing. While we both expected that to be a sequel, being the masochist I am, I stuck around for the entire DLC Season Pass. I've since replayed nearly the entire game and all the DLC, save for Contagion mode, which is actually too sadistic even for my tastes, and only makes the game harder than hardcore mode. That's all it offers. Go figure, next to nobody's bothered with that, especially since it costs a whopping $10. I won't kink shame you, but at least Ranger mode in Metro was balanced. Still, after being given an extensive list of feedback by critics and players, Striking Distance seemingly, begrudgingly, at least at every level but management, tried to take some of that input and refine the game and its expansions. What's fascinating and important for context is that we actually know the management team were aware the game was too unforgiving and lacking in certain respects. Because there's an Ars Technica interview where they gleefully discuss how lower-ranking developers were outright complaining that they couldn't properly test the game in an efficient manner due to how hard it was.
I think the game should be brutal and punishing. I'm pushing for that. And then other people on the team will hear, what? Why'd you make it so hard? I'm trying to do my work. That kind of thing will happen, just for fun. Just for fun.
Even things like audio logs only playing while standing still were deliberate decisions by the exact people advertised as being experts of survival horror, when in fact, it's quite clear that their supposedly less than experienced new blood had a far clearer idea of what needed to be done. While many of my complaints of the campaign persist, I will say that enough has been improved from launch that it's at least like a 5 or a 5.5 out of 10 now instead of a 4. Which isn't much, but it's something. Enemy spawns have been tweaked, variety of encounters has been marginally improved, you heal faster than it takes an iceberg to melt, the two-header is only half as unbearable as before, and Sam Witwer doesn't constantly try to give you a prostate exam during the final fight anymore. It's still a poorly written, utterly adolescent idea of what constitutes psychological horror. The pacing is incredibly dreadful all over the place, either racing ahead far too quickly or dragging things out needlessly. New Game Plus is finally added, yet they had the balls to only make your upgrades carry over, not the equipment, ammo, or credits in your inventory, meaning you still only get to experience the full breadth of your arsenal over halfway through the campaign, which basically defeats the whole point of a New Game Plus mode. What's perhaps most hilarious is the bittersweet inclusion of a Dead Space mode called Dismemberment Mode, with the copy text describing it in some of the most passive aggression I've seen a studio extend to its players. Especially given how hard they leaned on Dead Space past association in the marketing. Go figure, people want what they paid for instead of a poor man's Star Wars Obi-Wan. Except all achievements are disabled in this mode because apparently it's not hardcore enough. Because if there's one thing that matters to Schofield, it's apparently being as hardcore as possible.
Just for fun.
This is a weird fixation even in the other DLC, with most achievements either being totally random events or utterly tedious nonsense. But without further ado, let's get into it. Starting with... Yeah, it's a shame, because Riot mode is good enough I'd argue you could sell it as a standalone product. I'm serious. I would so easily have picked this up on PC for like $10 on its own if I just could ignore the rest of it. Don't get me wrong, it's not like it's worth buying the deluxe edition or anything. When the game is inevitably like $6 on a Steam sale, then maybe pick this up. But as it stands, you still only get one map. For $10, seemingly assembled by a handful of lower-ranking employees, if that. Only 2 actually were on comment for interview with the single website, so it's not clear how many more besides them actually got to work on it. Except that's the thing. With Schofield and company busy working on Final Transmission, the story DLC, that meant that Riot Mode's designer had, as he explained as delicately as he could in that aforementioned interview, the freedom to rip out anything that interrupted any kind of flow state that might make the game fun. Riot Mode is Callisto streamlined to the point even its most awkward elements actually work. Essentially, every complaint leveled at the campaign is solved, which makes it all the more abundantly clear that there were developers who knew the direction given by management wasn't going to pan out well. Who could have seen it coming? You mean the people here to make a game instead of smearing their actual blood on paper might have ideas as well? Madness! Why would we listen to them instead? More smearing blood on paper. I can't believe that's actually a thing that happened. Seriously, that's in an interview in one of their documentaries.
So we went to actually pierce our finger a little bit to get some blood in there. And then we actually recorded how the blood will change over time to understand all the range of colors that blood can have, from very fresh to, how it looks like after 45, 1 hour. And we have that, we made that available for artists as reference.
Jorge has definitely pushed a lot of boundaries.
Just for fun.
That is not a healthy work environment. What hurts in particular is how Riot tends to explain just about everything mechanically that the campaign doesn't. The alt-fire modes for your guns are meant as a response to when the biophage zombies mutate, taking them down despite their hardened exteriors, with the higher risk reward given that you're wasting more ammo on a single shot, but potentially to take out a much more hostile and dangerous opponent before they can smash you. Fair enough. The dodge function is actually far better at handling itself in open environments, which is most of what Riot's map is about. In fact, it hilariously actually features more areas of the prison that people wanted to see in the campaign, like a cafeteria and a prison yard. This feels like an actual space in a prison, not just some random derelict space station that happens to be prison themed. And yes, I know it's set on a moon, but realistically, until you actually get to the lunar surface, it feels like you might as well be in a space station. The perk selection you can choose from adds great replay value, though some are explicitly more useful than others. The grip and the various death traps aren't contrived rooms where you're permitted to use them, but instead normal parts of the environment that feel organic. Bolstered by letting the player trigger most of them, instead of them being this random hazard that you might accidentally set off and or walk into without even intending to. Guns can be upgraded so much more quickly that it's possible to enjoy them and really appreciate each of them against every enemy type. And there's actually more than 2 robots to fight. I'm not kidding when I say I've probably spent as much time in Riot mode as I did in my second playthrough of the entire game, and I've heard others express the same. Sure, the contrived rampage power-up is silly, but it's basically a get-out-of-jail-free card to eliminate any 2-headers that get spawned. Some enemies seem to even exhibit previously unseen behaviors, such as the tiny worms actually functioning as more than QTE jump scares. You will encounter better enemy combinations here that are never present in the main campaign. It's astonishing how much of an improvement this glorified mod pack is than the game it's sold with. And at the time, it was a glimmer of hope for what this franchise could have evolved into. Except Schofield and company and their continued efforts to misread their own property's potential and what their audience was feeling like appear to have come to a very different conclusion if Final Transmission is anything to go by. Final Transmission isn't as bad as the main game, which is such a backhanded compliment, but sadly that's kind of the grading scale we're working with here. It's also nowhere near as good as Riot Mode, but that's not surprising given that it apparently isn't the epilogue DLC that was planned. No shock given Sam Witwer's sudden revival jump scare goes nowhere and how the story tries to desperately tie itself off with a definitive bow with as few resources as possible. There's a new melee weapon, but it's essentially just a BFG in the form of a hammer, negating any stun baton upgrades you've acquired beforehand. Which is ironic because I appreciate that you can import your upgrades from the main game or start fresh, but no one in their right mind will want to do the latter unless they hate themselves. Instead, Final Transmission just feels like a last gasp of what could have been had the creative leads listened to their team and also maybe tried to actually put any psychology into their psychological horror. It's still done very bluntly. The twist is in no way particularly groundbreaking, and I won't spoil it here, but it's still somewhat better than what we got before. It at least tries to be clever and doesn't just feel like some weird ripoff of Dead Space and Assassin's Creed. So there's that, well, except for the text logs, but we'll get to that. Granted, this is the same DLC that proudly introduces robot zombies as the only new enemy type aside from a final boss that, while not as bad as Sam Witwer's zombified form, also isn't holding a candle to any boss fights in the countless survival horror games before and doubtless to come. It's just a standard enemy you fought before, but now with a health bar and slightly altered attack patterns. This half-step forward vibe is overwhelmingly persistent throughout the entire DLC, making the experience all the more mournful because you can really tell that if they had more time and if there had been some different creative direction, something really meaningful could have probably been pulled out of this IP instead of what we got. This all could have led to a fantastic new sci-fi horror series, or at least an unintentionally amusing one. Instead, the Callisto Protocol makes you feel sad about all its wasted potential. How they prioritize death animations over a clear combat loop that could have stood out if it flowed half as well in the campaign as it does in Riot mode. It might have stuck with players narratively if it was half as ambitious in how it framed things as they do in the Final Transmission. Again, those text logs are doing a lot of heavy lifting, even if the Secret Society is so just Templar Illuminati baseline nonsense that I can't even remember their fake made-up name because it's obviously just the Illuminati. And if this is to be taken quite literally as the ending for the entire IP, that sucks, because there are perfectly good ideas left on the table, or should I say on the tabletop. Helix Station is a free audio drama that serves as a prequel to the game, although frankly you can ignore that since other than a cameo by resident MVP Sam Witwer and a hint that this is what spurs Danny Nakamura to luck into Black Iron Prison in the main game, Helix Station is practically a standalone product. It's basically a fanficky reimagining of Aliens that contains all the actually interesting lore of the Callisto Protocol that a $161 million project just couldn't get around to, even in its DLC. Forget the space Illuminati and Joe what's-his-name and all the pointless bickering that went nowhere. Helix Station is Gwendolyn Christie and Michael Ironside, alongside a strong supporting cast, facing off against threats both mechanical and biological. Since it's free, I'll, again, avoid spoilers and endorse you to give it a listen. It's less than 3 hours long, features outstanding acting that's far better than this IP warrants, and has one of my favorite final fights between a protagonist and monster in a story like this. It's really creative, and I would have loved to see how it could have been interpreted in a game. The audio design is equally stellar, really making you picture it all. This really vivid depiction of PTSD is good to see as well. It's a better portrayal of trauma than in the main game. Plus, on top of finding out humanity can go all gummy and weird from too much time in Zero G, we also learned that there was a Terminator-esque AI war on Mars? You're telling me that we could have, if someone had put 2 and 2 together, had the choice of Aliens but starring Gwendolyn Christie as a drug-addicted Boba Fett wannabe, Terminator but on Mars, or this glorified match of PUBG by way of Dead Space 3, and somehow, out of all of these options that they could have gone with, they chose the last one, PUBG in space. Out of everything that's there, this universe has more fascinatingly twisted facets than I could have imagined, and they buried them. For crying out loud, literally any story other than the one they put the most money in tends to be better. The only one that falls flat is the collector's edition comic, which thankfully I was able to read, but also, wow, it was really slapdash and the art direction doesn't click or anything. That's why it's not highlighted in this list as a thing worth tracking down, because you can track it down, it ain't anything worth reading. But that is all the more baffling, because then that's the thing that's more emphasized as important to the game, and it's actually way less significant. What was the priority here? What was going through the minds of everyone on this? Why was Josh Duhamel's Bad Day Above Jupiter so important to tell? Why was this the big story you needed to depict? Glenn, it's a shame. To be fair, a lot of things with the Callisto Protocol are, but hey, at least it's something. And if you're stuck with a copy like I am, at least there's that.